In July 1940, the Luftwaffe was not defeated by a secret weapon. It was defeated first by a document. A report moved through German headquarters with the clean confidence of a weapon already aimed. It told Hermann Göring what he wanted to believe. Britain had been pushed to the edge. France was gone. The British Army had escaped Dunkirk without the heavy body of a modern army. And the Royal Air Force, according to Luftwaffe intelligence, was no longer a full fighting force. It was thin. It was tired. It was short of pilots. It was short of aircraft. And if the Luftwaffe struck hard enough, it would break in about 4 weeks. That estimate did not merely shape German expectations. It shaped the battle plan. The air campaign that followed, Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack, was built around a promise that sounded almost mathematical. Hit southern England with enough force, destroy fighter command, clear the skies, open the channel, then let invasion become possible. 4 weeks. That was the clock. But the clock had been set by men who were measuring the wrong air force. They were not measuring British production as it actually stood. They were not measuring the British pilot system as it was functioning. They were not measuring the radar network as a living command machine. And they were not measuring the commander who had spent years building a defense that did not need to be everywhere at once. So when the Luftwaffe crossed the channel that summer, it did not fly into the RAF described in its files. It flew into the RAF the files had failed to see. Josef Schmid, the Luftwaffe's intelligence chief, had the kind of confidence that can look like competence from a distance. He was not a careful intelligence professional in the modern sense. He was a staff officer who had advanced through loyalty, access, and instinct inside an organization that rewarded certainty more than doubt, and certainty is exactly what he delivered. His reports leaned on old British documents, indirect sources, assumptions repeated until they looked like evidence, and estimates built on earlier estimates that had never been properly rechecked. The weaknesses were not hidden in a single bad number. They were spread through the whole method. Schmid did not know how many fighters British factories were really producing. He did not know how deep the replacement pipeline was. He did not understand fighter command as a system. He did not have a clear view into British operational doctrine, but he wrote as if he did. His picture of the RAF was brutally simple. Around 50 fighter squadrons, limited reserves, mediocre morale, production somewhere in the range of a few hundred fighters a month. A force that could be pushed past its limit once a first-class air force applied sustained pressure. The direction of the error mattered. It was not random. Every major mistake made Britain smaller. Across the channel, the reality was uglier for Germany. Under Lord Beaverbrook's pressure at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, British factories were accelerating output with the desperation of a country that understood the next battle might decide whether invasion remained theory or became a landing craft on the beach. In July alone, production of Hurricanes and Spitfires climbed beyond 460 fighters. That number was not just a factory statistic, it was time. Every airframe coming off a line gave fighter command one more chance to replace loss, rotate squadrons, preserve strength, and keep the visible front from becoming the true condition of the force. The pilot pipeline was under strain. It was not comfortable. It was not limitless. But it was not the hollow shell Schmid had imagined. And above all, fighter command was not a crowd of exhausted squadrons waiting to be found and destroyed. It was a controlled defensive machine. Hugh Dowding had built it that way. Dowding was not glamorous. He was not a theatrical battlefield commander. At 58, he seemed to many people inside the RAF like a difficult older man who said no too often and moved too carefully. But in the late 1930s, when pressure came to scatter Britain's fighters across other demands, Dowding resisted. Fighters were not to be spent casually. They were not to be thrown away in France to satisfy political urgency. They had to be preserved for the one battle that could not be lost. He kept the force together. Then he connected it to something the Luftwaffe saw but did not understand. By the summer of 1940, chain-home radar stations stood along the British coast, tall masts rising over cliffs and fields like strange industrial fences facing the sea. German reconnaissance had photographed them. German analysts knew they existed. The masts were not invisible. That was the dangerous part, because the Luftwaffe mistook seeing them for understanding them. To German planners, the towers looked vulnerable, awkward, and perhaps replaceable. They seemed like equipment, a target category, something that might be attacked, but not something around which the whole outcome of the air battle would turn. The real system was not the mast. The real system began after the mast saw something. A radar contact moved to filter rooms. Filtered information moved to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory. From there, the plot moved outward to group and sector operations rooms. Controllers decided which squadrons went up, from which airfield at what moment and toward which point in the sky. Detection became decision. Decision became scramble. Scramble became interception. Sometimes that sequence could move in minutes. For German bombers over the Channel, that was the difference between arriving above an empty field and finding British fighters already climbing into position. The Luftwaffe had fought air forces before. It had not fought this. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park understood the system from the inside. He commanded 11 Group, the force guarding southeastern England, the exact region the Germans needed to break. Park was not simply moving counters on a map. He knew his airfields. He knew his pilots. He knew how long a squadron needed to climb above a particular point on the coast. He flew his own Hurricane to inspect the ground he was defending. He understood that the battle would not be won by meeting every raid with everything available. It would be won by spending just enough force, at just the right time, while keeping the machine alive. That was the part Schmidt's reports did not measure. They counted aircraft. They did not count the time radar manufactured. They did not count the discipline Dowding preserved. They did not count Park's ability to move strength around damage before damage became collapse. So the Luftwaffe began its campaign with a dangerous half-truth. British airfields could be bombed, that was true. Runways could be cratered, hangars could burn, telephone lines could be cut, operations rooms could be shaken by blast and smoke. All of that was true. The false part was the assumption that visible damage meant systemic collapse. General Albert Kesselring, commanding Luftflotte 2 from the continent, expected pressure to compound, hit the sector stations, hit the airfields, hit the infrastructure repeatedly enough, and Fighter Command's ability to resist would come apart. On August 13, Adlertag, Eagle Day, the campaign began in earnest. The air over southern England filled with formations. Bombers came in across the water with fighter escorts above them, the kind of industrial movement that made air power look irresistible from a headquarters map. Targets were hit. Airfields were damaged. The strain became real almost immediately. Biggin Hill took repeated punishment. Kenley and Hornchurch absorbed attacks. Manston became nearly unusable as a forward fighter base. Communications were cut, repaired, rerouted, and cut again. Ground crews worked through damage faster than anyone had the right to expect. And Park's pilots paid for every interception with fatigue that did not show up cleanly on a German estimate. They flew multiple sorties a day. They ate quickly. They slept in fragments. They sat in cockpits waiting for the next scramble order, sometimes before the last shock had left their hands. Between August 8 and August 18, Fighter Command lost 154 pilots killed or seriously wounded. For Dowding, that number was not rhetoric. It was arithmetic. Britain could build aircraft faster than Germany believed, but experienced fighter pilots could not be stamped out like panels of aluminum. If losses continued at that pace, Fighter Command could still be strangled, not because Schmidt had been right, but because even a stronger system had a breaking point. Dowding warned the Air Ministry in plain terms. At the present rate of attrition, Fighter Command could cease to function effectively within weeks. The warning mattered because Dowding was not a man who inflated danger for drama. If he said the margin was narrowing, the margin was narrowing. And this is where the campaign became most dangerous for Britain. Not at the beginning, when Germany believed the RAF was already dying, but in late August, when the Luftwaffe was finally applying pressure to the part of the British system that could actually be broken. Sector stations were damaged. Forward airfields were under severe strain. Pilots were being used faster than the pipeline could comfortably replace them. Park was improvising inside a machine that still worked, but no longer worked easily. The German campaign had not yet won, but it had found the right nerve. Then Goering misread the pain. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, the absence of victory needed an explanation. The 4-week promise was slipping. Fighter Command had not disappeared. British aircraft were still rising from fields that intelligence had described as nearly exhausted. Hitler was impatient. The invasion season was limited. Goering's personal prestige was tied to the idea that the Luftwaffe could decide the matter quickly. A command structure that cannot question its premise will usually question its people. So Goering turned on his fighter commanders. He accused them of failing the bombers. He demanded more aggressive escort. He ordered Bf 109 units to fly closer to bomber formations, binding fighters to the pace and altitude of the aircraft they were meant to protect. That robbed the German fighters of the freedom that made them dangerous. Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders understood the problem. They protested. They knew fighter combat required height, speed, and initiative. Close escort might comfort bomber crews, but it made the fighters less effective. Goering dismissed the objections. The false picture survived contact with evidence, because the men who owned it still needed it to be true. Then on the night of August 24, German bombers dropped bombs on London, almost certainly after a navigational error. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The physical damage to Berlin was limited. The psychological damage to German prestige was not. Hitler was furious. The Luftwaffe's focus began to shift. This was the moment that saved fighter command from the most dangerous version of the campaign. The German leadership believed it was escalating. London would be hit. British morale would be broken. The capital would become the target that completed the destruction of British resistance. But London was not the part of the system that had been closest to failure. The sector stations were. The airfields were. The communications links were. The pilots being ground down day after day were. By turning toward London, Germany took weight off the one structure that had been beginning to bend. For the people of London, this was not relief. It was terror. Fire, rubble, night raids, dead civilians, families in shelters, a capital forced into a new kind of war. But operationally, for fighter command, it was a reprieve. Runways could be patched, operations rooms could be repaired, telephone lines could be restored, squadrons could breathe for a few days. Pilots could get just enough rest to remain pilots and not merely exhausted men strapped into aircraft. The system that had been absorbing damage faster than it could heal was given time. Not much time. Enough. Goring believed he was closing his fist. He had opened it. On September 15, he still believed the paper version of the RAF. Schmidt's assessments continued to show fighter command as nearly spent. Fewer than 300 operational fighters. Morale weakening. Squadrons destroyed or badly reduced. One more concentrated blow, delivered hard enough against southeastern England, should finally produce the collapse promised since summer. That morning, 2 major waves of German bombers and fighters crossed the channel. In British operations rooms, markers moved across plotting tables. Women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force updated positions as reports came in. Controllers watched the raids take shape. Telephones rang. Sector stations received orders. Park launched everything he could from 11 Group. Dowding released reinforcements from 12 Group, and over southern England, the Luftwaffe encountered the problem that had been waiting inside its own intelligence failure. The RAF was still there, not symbolically, not as a handful of desperate survivors, not as the last broken edge of a dying force, in numbers. More than 300 British fighters were in the air across the day, including squadrons German intelligence had already treated as destroyed, exhausted, or unavailable. For German crews, the shock was not just tactical. It was psychological. They had been briefed into certainty. They had been told the enemy was nearly finished. They had flown into the expectation that resistance should be thin, disorganized, and fading. Instead, they saw fresh formations climbing into them from the clouds and sun. It felt, to some German airmen, as if Britain had been hiding a reserve all along. But Britain had not hidden the decisive thing. Germany had failed to understand it. The factories had kept producing. The pilots had kept arriving. The radar stations had kept watching. The filter rooms had kept sorting chaos into usable information. The sector controllers had kept turning warning into interception. And the commanders who understood the system had kept it from being spent all at once. British fighter production in August reached 476 aircraft, far above the German estimates that had helped shape the campaign. Chain homes still functioned. Park's squadrons were worn but not gone. Dowding's structure was bruised but not blind. The Luftwaffe had expected a final blow against a collapsing opponent. It flew into a defense that had bent without breaking. The losses on September 15 were severe enough to change the meaning of the campaign. Around 60 German aircraft were destroyed, but the aircraft were only part of the cost. Experienced bomber crews, navigators, formation leaders, and men who had survived the campaign's hardest weeks were killed or captured. A bomber can be replaced as a production problem. A crew that knows how to find a target through cloud, fighters, fear, and flak is harder to replace. Inside the Luftwaffe, the response revealed the deeper failure. Goring did not seriously ask whether Schmidt's intelligence picture had been structurally wrong. He asked why the escorts had failed. He asked why the bombers had not been protected. He looked for failure at the point of contact, not at the point where the battle had first been imagined. Galland later told the famous story of Goering asking what his fighter pilots needed. Galland answered, A squadron of Spitfires. It was an insult, but it was also a confession of respect. The daylight campaign continued, but its central promise was gone. The Luftwaffe could bomb, it could hurt Britain, it could kill civilians, destroy streets, and make winter nights terrifying. But it could not do the thing Operation Sea Lion required. It could not own the daylight sky over southern England. Air superiority is not the same as damage. It is not the same as courage. It is not the same as sending more aircraft into danger. Air superiority means the freedom to operate over the enemy with enough control to make invasion possible. By late September, that freedom was not coming. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The daylight offensive faded into the nighttime bombing campaign that would become the Blitz. The war did not become gentle. It became different, but the invasion window had closed. By the time the Battle of Britain ended on October 31, the cost was written in wreckage and graves. The Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,700 aircraft. More than 2,500 German aircrew were killed, with many more captured. Fighter Command had lost more than 1,000 aircraft and 537 pilots killed. Both sides had paid terribly. Only one side had failed to achieve the thing it came to do, and after all of it, Josef Schmid remained in his post. That may be the most revealing fact in the story, because an intelligence failure can be survived if an organization is willing to study why it happened. Bad numbers can be corrected, bad assumptions can be broken, bad methods can be rebuilt, but a command culture that protects the assumption after the battle has disproved it is carrying the failure forward. The Luftwaffe did not simply underestimate aircraft. It underestimated a system. It saw radar masts and missed the command network behind them. It counted squadrons and missed how they were controlled. It saw bomb craters and overestimated what craters meant. It saw London as a decisive target and missed the operational reprieve it was giving the RAF. It saw pilots in the sky and assumed they were the last ones. Again and again, Germany treated the visible surface as the whole truth. Dowding did not. Park did not. Dowding knew that fighters were a national reserve, not a political gesture. Park knew that minutes mattered more than dramatic mass attacks. Ground crews knew a damaged airfield was not dead if men could fill craters, patch lines, and keep one strip usable. Controllers knew a raid became less frightening when it could be located, tracked, and met before it arrived. This was not romance. It was procedure under pressure. Keith Park was later removed from 11 Group, damaged not by German victory but by internal RAF politics. Dowding too would leave command. The men who had protected the system did not receive simple fairy tale endings. But the system had done what it was built to do. It kept Britain in the war. That fact widened into everything that followed. Britain remained an air base, a naval base, an intelligence center, an island arsenal, a place from which the war could keep expanding. The Atlantic fight, American entry, the buildup of 1942 and 1943, the return to Europe in 1944. None of those later chapters looks the same if Britain falls in 1940. The Luftwaffe came close enough for the danger to be real. That is why the failure matters. Not because Germany was weak, not because German pilots lacked courage, not because British victory was inevitable. It matters because a powerful force carried a false image into a battle where image and reality separated under fire. The report said the RF was nearly broken. The radar screen said otherwise. The factory said otherwise. The Bates pilots climbing into the morning said otherwise. The burned but working sector stations said otherwise. The Luftwaffe brought aircraft, skill, experience, and confidence to the Battle of Britain. What it did not bring was the truth.